The battlefield of Voldemort had been silent for 3 centuries. No bird landed there. No grass grew. Even the wind seemed to avoid the stretch of cracked earth where the final battle between the kingdom of Erath and the mythical Orvini people had ended, not with a victor, but with a sudden, terrible stillness. At the center of that stillness stood her. Soldiers called her the Golden Warden. Travelers detoured 3 villages out of their way just to avoid her shadow. Children in Erath grew up hearing her name as a warning, General Seraphine of the Orvini, the woman who had reportedly killed 400 soldiers in a single afternoon, whose eyes could stop a heart, whose hands had once split a river in 2 just by reaching toward it. She stood 8 feet tall in her armor. Not because she was 8 feet tall, nobody actually knew how large she was beneath it. The enchanted golden plating had fused around her mid-battle, layer by layer, sealing her inside a towering shell that made her look less like a woman and more like a god someone had decided to punish. 300 years of reign hadn't rusted it. 300 years of ambitious kings hadn't moved it. One particularly foolish sorcerer had tried to melt it with dragon fire channeled through a crystal staff. The armor absorbed the fire. The sorcerer did not survive the armor's response. So she stood. Season after season. Century after century. Until King Aldrich IV, a man whose primary gift was spending inherited gold faster than his ancestors had accumulated it, ran desperately low on resources during the current border war with the eastern provinces. His war minister, a hawk-nosed man named Lord Fenwick, had a practical idea. "The armor is made of Orvini gold steel," Fenwick said, spreading a map across the king's table. "Rare enough that one chest plate alone could fund 6 months of campaign. We melt it down. Every man who's touched it has burned," the king reminded him. "Then we send someone expendable." Fenwick smiled thinly. "We send a blacksmith." Aaron Vesper was 23 years old, unremarkable in almost every measurable way, and deeply annoyed to have been chosen. He wasn't the kingdom's best blacksmith. That honor belonged to his mentor, old Torvin, who had conveniently developed a mysterious back ailment the morning the royal summons arrived. He wasn't the bravest man in Caldenmere village. He wasn't particularly tall, particularly strong, or particularly anything. What he was available. They gave him a cart, a mule named Bessie who hated him, 3 soldiers as escort, and a set of instructions that amounted to, touch the armor, melt what you can, don't die if possible. He arrived at Voldemort at dusk. The soldiers stopped at the tree line. They had families, they explained. Responsibilities. They would wait for him right here. Aaron walked onto the battlefield alone. The dead earth crunched under his boots. The air tasted like iron and something older, like the smell inside ancient libraries, like time itself had settled here and gone slightly stale. He could see her from 100 meters away, silhouetted against the bruised evening sky, enormous and golden and absolutely motionless. He stopped 10 feet away and studied her. The armor was extraordinary. Even in the failing light, it caught what sun remained and held it, warm and amber, like the metal had its own internal fire. The craftsmanship was beyond anything he'd ever seen, overlapping plates that flowed like water frozen mid-movement, engravings so fine they looked drawn rather than carved, a helmet that covered everything above the jaw, leaving only. Aaron leaned closer. A mouth. Slightly parted. Perfectly preserved lips, neither grimacing nor screaming, but caught in an expression that looked almost like surprise. Not the face of a monster. Not the face of a general mid-conquest. The face of someone who had not expected what happened to them. Aaron removed his glove and, before the more sensible part of his brain could object, pressed his bare palm flat against the armor's chest plate. Every soldier who'd touched it had described burning. Searing. Like pressing flesh to a forge that had been running for a week. What Aaron felt was warmth. Not painful warmth. Not threatening warmth. The warmth of a hand held too long in someone else's. And then, beneath his palm, so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination, he felt it. A heartbeat. The armor cracked. The crack ran from the center of the chest plate upward, branching like frost on winter glass, splitting the golden surface in delicate fractures that glowed faintly orange at their edges, as if the heat had been waiting inside the metal for exactly this moment to escape. Aaron stumbled backward. The 3 soldiers at the tree line, who had been watching from a careful distance with the dedication of men who decided cowardice and survival were essentially synonymous, turned and ran without a word spoken between them. Aaron stayed. He wasn't sure why. Later he would tell people it was professional curiosity, a blacksmith's instinct to understand what a metal was doing. That was mostly a lie. The truth was simpler and harder to explain. The heartbeat he'd felt beneath his palm had been frightened. And he had never in his life been able to walk away from something frightened. The cracking spread. Over the course of an hour, the armor seemed to breathe for the first time in centuries, expanding slightly, contracting, the golden plates shifting against each other with sounds like distant bells. Each fracture released a breath of warmth into the cold evening air, and where the warmth touched the dead earth of Voldemort, something peculiar happened. Color appeared. Not flowers, not yet. Just the faintest suggestion of green beneath the gray. A memory of life, surfacing cautiously, the way a shy animal approaches an outstretched hand. Aaron circled her slowly, studying the cracking patterns, his blacksmith's mind cataloging what his emotional mind was struggling to process. The armor wasn't simply breaking. It was disassembling, the enchantment unwinding in careful sequence, each plate loosening in an order that suggested architecture rather than destruction. Someone had designed this armor to be removed. They had simply never anticipated the right hands. By midnight, 3 plates had fallen on their own. By dawn, Aaron had carefully, painstakingly worked his hands into the loosened seams and removed 7 more. He was sweating despite the cold. Not from exertion, from something closer to reverence. Each piece of gold steel that came away in his hands was warm, almost living, and heavier than its size suggested, as if it carried the weight of every year it had stood here. At the 6th hour of work, the helmet loosened. Aaron hesitated. He stood on a makeshift platform of supply crates he'd dragged from his cart, bringing himself level with a face he'd only seen from the jaw down. His hands rested on either side of the helmet's base. He lifted it away. The woman beneath was not what 3 centuries of legend had described. She was his age. Perhaps younger, it was difficult to tell with the stillness of enchanted sleep. Her face was angular and proud, with high cheekbones that carried the faint golden undertone of Orvini heritage, dark lashes pressed against her cheeks, and hair, black as ink, long as memory, that had been compressed against her skull by the helmet and now sprang free in waves, falling past her shoulders like something that had also been waiting. A scar ran from her left jaw to her collarbone. Old. Pre-armor. She had been in battles before this one. Aaron stood on his crate in the early morning silence, holding a 300-year-old helmet, looking at a sleeping face, and felt something shift in his chest that he had absolutely no framework for. He set the helmet down carefully. "I'm going to get you out," he told her, for no practical reason. She couldn't hear him. "I don't know what happens after that, but I'm going to get you out." It took him another full day. The chest plate was last. The largest. The most elaborately engraved. He had been avoiding it, working around it, removing arms and shoulders and back plates first, and he understood now why. The chest plate was the lock. Everything else had been the door frame. He had freed her arms and legs and back. She was held upright now by nothing but the chest plate and whatever enchantment lived at the armor's core. Beneath the removed pieces, he could see her clothing, ancient by style, surprisingly intact, dark fabric that had somehow survived 3 centuries against skin that was warm to the touch when his fingers accidentally brushed her wrist while repositioning a clamp. He pulled his hand back fast. Her pulse was steady. Strong, even. "All right," Aaron muttered, gripping the edges of the chest plate. "All right." He pulled. The battlefield moved. Not an earthquake, something deeper. The earth beneath Voldemort exhaled, a subsonic groan that Aaron felt in his teeth and his sternum and the hollow behind his eyes. The cracked gray soil split in 100 places simultaneously, and from each crack came the same tentative color he'd seen the night before, green, insistent, alive, pushing upward through 3 centuries of dead earth with the urgency of something that had been holding its breath for a very long time. The chest plate came free. Aaron caught her as she fell. She was lighter than he expected. Or he was stronger than he knew. Either way, she came down against his chest and he went to one knee on the transformed ground, no longer cracked gray earth but soft, living soil, and held a 300-year-old general who looked 20 years old and was trembling like a child. Her eyes opened. They were amber. Exactly the color the armor had been. They found his face with the desperate focus of someone grabbing the first solid thing in a flood, and what Aaron saw in them wasn't the calculated intelligence of a legendary general, wasn't ancient malice, wasn't the confidence of someone who had split rivers with her bare hands. What he saw was terror. Where, her voice was 3 centuries unused. It came out fractured, barely sound. "Where is the battle?" "Over," Aaron said. "It's been over for 300 years. Her amber eyes searched his face for the lie. She didn't find one. And General Seraphine of the Orvini, the Golden Warden, the woman kingdoms had feared for centuries, pressed her forehead against the shoulder of a blacksmith she'd never met and made a sound that was not the war cry of legend. It was the sound of someone who had been terrified for a very, very long time, finally breaking. She didn't speak for 3 days. Aaron had not planned for this contingency. His instructions had been melt the armor, return with the metal. His instructions had not covered revive ancient general, establish temporary camp on supernaturally blooming battlefield, attempt communication with woman who has been magically unconscious since before your great-great-grandmother was born. He sent Bessie the mule back toward Caldenmere with a note tied to her saddle that said, approximately, situation complicated. Send food. Don't send Lord Fenwick. He built a fire. He set up the canvas shelter from his supply cart. He placed Seraphine, he couldn't call her the Golden Warden, not while she sat wrapped in his spare cloak staring at the flowers that had covered Voldemort overnight as if they were personally accusing her of something, near the warmth and left space between them. She ate when he put food in front of her. She slept in short, violent bursts, waking with her hands braced against the ground, eyes searching for a battle that had ended 3 centuries ago. Each time she woke, Aaron said the same thing, calm as he could manage. You're safe. The war is over. You're in Voldemort. I'm Aaron. By the second day, she stopped reaching for a weapon that wasn't there when she woke. By the third day, she spoke. You're very small, she said. Aaron looked up from the boot he was mending. I've been told. For a soldier. I'm not a soldier. I'm a blacksmith. She absorbed this. Her amber eyes dropped to his hands, calloused, scarred in the particular way of forge work, permanently stained at the nail beds with metal residue. She seemed to find this information confusing and somehow also reassuring. A blacksmith, she repeated. They sent a blacksmith to melt my armor. They sent an expendable blacksmith, Aaron said. There's a distinction. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. The memory of a smile, finding its way back. I was going to be melted down. That was the plan, yes. And instead she looked at the flowers surrounding them. At the battlefield that had been dead for 3 centuries and was now carpeted in something that looked almost aggressively alive, wildflowers in colors Aaron didn't have names for, grasses that swayed in wind that wasn't blowing, a single tree that had grown to knee height in 3 days from what had been bare rock. You did this. You did this. I didn't mean to. The best things rarely get meant, Aaron said, which was something his mother used to say and which he'd never really understood until this moment. Seraphine turned to look at him directly for the first time since she'd opened her eyes. She had a way of looking at people that he suspected had unnerved enemies and allies alike, completely still, completely focused, as if she were cataloging everything about a person simultaneously and rendering a judgment she hadn't decided to share yet. Tell me, she said, what year it is. He told her. Her expression didn't change, but her hands, resting on her knees, pressed slightly harder against the fabric of his borrowed cloak. 300 years. He watched her do the arithmetic. He watched her arrive at the answer. He watched her decide not to show him what the answer cost her. The Orvini, she said carefully. My people. I don't. Aaron chose his words with the carefulness of a man who had never needed to be careful with words before and was suddenly aware that this one mattered. The war ended, but I don't know how. I wasn't taught much history about the Orvini. What I know, I'll tell you. That implies there isn't much to tell. It implies the people writing history didn't want to tell it. He met her eyes. Which is different. She studied him for a long moment. You're surprisingly intelligent for someone who was sent to melt me. I'm surprisingly a lot of things, Aaron said. The almost smile returned. This time it made it. That night, the fire burned low and they stayed beside it longer than warmth required, and Seraphine began to speak, slowly at first, then with the urgency of someone emptying a vessel that had been full for 300 years. She told him about the war from her side, which was nothing like the version Aaron had learned. She told him about the Orvini, not monsters, not mythical beings in the way the stories meant it, but people with particular gifts who had wanted particular things that the kingdom of Erath had decided they weren't allowed to want. She told him about the spell. Who had cast it, and why. It wasn't an enemy's doing, she said. The armor was my general's doing. My own commander. He said my power was too dangerous to risk in the final battle. That the armor would preserve me until peace was made. A pause. He didn't tell me how long peace might take. That's a terrible thing to do to someone. He thought he was protecting me. She looked at the fire. Everyone who has ever tried to control me has thought they were protecting me. Aaron didn't say anything. But he shifted slightly, closing the distance between them by 6 careful inches, and when she didn't move away, he stayed there, close enough that the warmth between them was no longer just the fire. I kept dreaming, she said quietly. Inside the armor. Not real dreams, impressions. Seasons. I could feel seasons changing against the metal. 300 of them. A pause. It was very lonely. You're not alone now, Aaron said. He wasn't sure why he said it. It was true, and it needed saying, and sometimes those were the only 2 requirements. Seraphine looked at him sidelong. Then she leaned, slowly, deliberately, giving him every opportunity to misunderstand and correct her, until her shoulder rested against his. They sat like that until the fire went out. In the morning, the tree had grown another foot. Lord Fenwick arrived on the 7th day with 40 soldiers, a royal decree, and the specific energy of a man who had not gotten what he wanted and intended to escalate until he did. Aaron saw them coming from half a mile away. The road that had once bypassed Voldemort now led directly into it, because the transformation of the battlefield had become impossible to ignore. Word had spread fast. Travelers were coming to see the flowers. Merchants were already arguing about who owned the land. A monk from the eastern provinces had arrived 2 days prior, looked at the blooming field in reverent silence for an hour, and declared it a sacred site before Aaron could explain the more complicated reality. Seraphine stood beside Aaron as the soldiers approached and watched them the way she watched everything now, with the still, cataloging attention of a general who had never stopped being one, even when she was trying to be something else. "The small frightened one in the expensive coat," she said. "He's the problem." "Lord Fenwick," Aaron confirmed. "War Minister. He's the one who sent me to melt you." She tilted her head slightly. "He looks like a man who has never held a sword himself but has sent many others to hold them." "That's him exactly." Fenwick pulled up 20 feet away, staying on his horse, which Aaron recognized as a deliberate power calculation. He looked at Seraphine with an expression that was trying very hard to be imperious and was failing, because Seraphine looked back with the expression of someone who had faced actual armies and found a nervous minister on a tall horse to be, at best, a minor footnote. "The Golden Warden," Fenwick announced, with the performative gravity of someone who'd rehearsed this on the ride over. "By decree of King Aldrich IV, you are hereby claimed as a resource of the Kingdom of Erath and required to—" "No," Seraphine said. Fenwick blinked. He had clearly not prepared for no this early in the speech. "I haven't finished." "You were going to tell me that I belong to your king," Seraphine said. "The answer to that is the same regardless of how long it takes you to say it." "She has a point," Aaron offered helpfully. Fenwick's eyes cut to him with genuine venom. "You were sent to melt armor and return with metal, blacksmith. You have committed what amounts to treason against." "He freed me," Seraphine said, and something in her voice changed when she said it, dropped half a register, became something quieter and more absolute. "And what was done to me before he arrived was done by your kingdom's magic, your kingdom's war. I owe Erath nothing. Less than nothing." The soldiers shifted. Not toward them, back. Aaron noticed it. The flowers at the soldiers' feet had begun to move, turning slightly, orienting toward Seraphine the way flowers turn toward sun. The grasses had grown 3 inches in the last 60 seconds. Fenwick noticed too. His horse was nervous. "We are not here to threaten you," Fenwick tried, recalibrating. "The kingdom merely wishes to discuss." "I know what the kingdom wishes to discuss," Seraphine said. "Every kingdom wishes the same thing. They want to know if they can use me. They want to know which side I'll choose. They want to know if I'll be a weapon for them or a weapon against them." She looked at the soldiers, then back to Fenwick. "I am neither." "Then what are you?" Fenwick demanded, and for the first time the mask slipped and what came through was genuine fear wearing the coat of indignation. Seraphine was quiet for a moment. "Deciding," she said. That night, after Fenwick and his soldiers had retreated to a camp at the field's edge to send urgent letters to the capital, Aaron found Seraphine standing at the center of Voldemort, where the first crack had appeared in the armor, where the first flower had bloomed. She stood very still, her eyes closed, her hands slightly raised, and around her the flowers moved in patterns that had nothing to do with wind. He stopped a respectful distance away. "I can feel them," she said, without opening her eyes. "All of it. Every living thing for 10 miles. I've always been able to, but the armor suppressed it. Made it small." A pause. "Now it's very loud. Is that terrible?" "No." She opened her eyes and looked at him. The amber was brighter at night, he'd noticed. Like the metal it resembled, catching available light and holding it. "It's like, imagine you've been hearing a melody played very quietly through a wall your whole life. And then someone removes the wall. And now it's overwhelming? And now it's music." Something passed across her face, complex, multiple emotions resolving into one that Aaron couldn't immediately name. She crossed the distance between them without announcement, which was her way of doing most things, and stood closer than was probably warranted by their 1 week of acquaintance. "Aaron," she said. "What am I supposed to do now?" It was such a human question. Such a surprisingly young question, from a woman who had been a general and a legend and a frozen monument. He thought about it with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know," he said. "I think that's the point. I think you're the first person in 300 years who actually gets to choose." She was close enough that he could see the old scar along her jaw in the moonlight. Without entirely deciding to, he reached up and touched it lightly, the way he touched metals he was trying to understand, with the pads of his fingers, reading texture and history. She went very still. "Sorry," he started. "Don't apologize," she said quietly. "I was deciding whether I minded." And? She turned her face slightly into his hand. A barely perceptible motion. An answer that required no words. He stayed there, in the warm dark, with a 300-year-old general leaning her scarred jaw against his calloused palm, and felt the ground beneath his feet still soft, still living, still quietly, insistently growing. They came from every direction on the 15th day. Arath's forces arrived from the west, not 40 soldiers this time, but 400, with King Aldrich himself making the journey, dressed in ceremonial armor that had never seen actual combat. From the east came the forces of the Margrave of Stellenport, who had heard of the Golden Warden's awakening and wanted her for his own border war. And from the south, something none of them had expected, a delegation traveling under no kingdom's banner, wearing the old colors of the Orvini. Not an army. 12 people. Elders, by their bearing. Moving across the bloomed battlefield of Valdenmoor with the careful reverence of people returning to a grave they had tended in their hearts for 3 centuries. Seraphine saw them first. She had been sitting beside Aaron at the morning fire, their shoulders touching with the easy comfort of people who have stopped pretending they need a reason for proximity, when she went suddenly still. He followed her gaze to the south. "You know them?" he asked. "Not them specifically," she said. "But their faces. The Orvini carry certain things in how they hold themselves." A pause. "My people survived." She said it the way people say things they have been afraid to want. What happened next happened quickly and slowly in the way that significant things always do, a mourning that lasted the length of a season, every moment waited. The Orvini delegation reached her first, before the armies converged, and the eldest among them, a woman with white hair and Seraphine's same angular cheekbones, stopped 10 feet away and looked at her with 3 centuries of grief wearing the disguise of a composed face. "General," the elder said. "Rena," Seraphine corrected, quietly. "My name is Rena." A pause. "The general was someone I was. I'm deciding who I am now." The elder's composed face broke open entirely. She crossed the remaining distance and took Seraphine's hands in hers, and the two of them stood very still while the armies massed at the field's edges and Aaron watched from beside the fire and thought, "She's been alone for 300 years, let them have this." Then the king arrived. Aldrich IV was not a terrible man, which in kings is sometimes almost as bad as being one. He was simply a frightened man with significant resources and a war he was losing, which made him dangerous in the specific way of people who need something from you. He made his appeal formally. Seraphine listened completely, which was a quality of hers that Aaron had come to recognize as distinct from agreement. She gave every speaker her full attention and reserved her answer until they'd finished, which confused people who expected interruption and rattled people who expected performance. The Margrave's representative spoke next. Offered more, land, title, resources, the careful transaction of men who think power is something you can purchase if you find the right denomination. Seraphine listened to that too. Then she walked to the center of Valdenmoor, to the place where she had stood frozen for 300 years, and turned to face everyone assembled, kings, soldiers, elders, merchants, the monk, the travelers, Aaron at the fire's edge, and she was quiet for long enough that the silence had its own texture. When she spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The wind carried her. "I have listened to what everyone wants from me," she said. "Now I'll tell you what I've decided to want for myself." She pressed both hands against the living ground of Valdenmoor. The flowers responded, every bloom on the field orienting toward her simultaneously, a golden wave of motion. This field was a battlefield. For 300 years it was dead. For 15 days it has been alive. That is what I do. That is what I am. I am not a weapon. I am not a deterrent. I am not a negotiating position. She stood up. "The war between Arath and the eastern provinces ends today," she said, "not because I'm threatening anyone, but because I am asking. And I am asking because the people dying in it are living things, and I can feel every living thing for 10 miles, and I have had enough of feeling things die." She looked at the king. Then at the Margrave's representative. "If you choose to continue it, you'll continue it without this land as a battleground. I will grow this field until it is a forest, and a forest does not discriminate between armored men." A silence. "That's not a threat?" King Aldrich asked, and to his credit, it was an earnest question, not a combative one. "It's a preference," Seraphine said. "I prefer peace. I am sharing my preference. What you do with your preferences is your own affair, but I will tell you, this is the first morning in 300 years that I have been warm and free and able to feel the grass under my feet, and I have very little patience left for the reasons why people choose to destroy things." She walked back through the flowers to the fire. To Aaron. She sat beside him, and the armies and the delegations and the kings all stared at them both, recalibrating. He handed her the tin cup he'd been holding. She took it and wrapped both hands around its warmth. "Well," she said quietly. "That's done." "Is it?" "It will take time. It always takes time." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had started doing 4 days ago and which he was fairly certain she had no idea she was doing. "But I said what I meant. That's rare enough to be worth something." He put his arm around her, which he had started doing 3 days ago and which he was entirely aware of every single time. Around them, the negotiators began to talk, hesitant at first, then with the cautious momentum of people discovering that a difficult conversation is slightly less difficult when the ground beneath their feet is inexplicably, persistently, beautifully alive. By evening, a temporary ceasefire had been agreed. By the following week, the Orvini elders and the Arath ministers were seated at the same table for the first time in recorded history, with Seraphine, Rena, present not as a general or a weapon or a political asset, but as someone who had been there for the beginning and was choosing to be here for something different. The tree at the center of Voldemort was now taller than a man. In a year, it would be an oak. In 10 years, the battlefield would be unrecognizable. Aaron set up a proper forge at Voldemort's edge, because someone had to make the tools that built peace, and because the woman who made things grow had mentioned, quietly, on an evening when the firelight was amber and the night was warm and the careful distance between people had dissolved into something without a name yet but with very clear intentions, that she had spent 300 years dreaming of seasons passing. She would like, she said, to stop dreaming and start staying. He said he thought he could work with that. Outside, in the field that had been dead for centuries, the flowers opened their faces to the dark and bloomed anyway, the particular, stubborn, extraordinary bloom of things that chose life not because it was safe or certain, but because the alternative was to stand still and frozen and armored against a world that was, against all odds, worth the risk of feeling. They would say, later, that the Golden Warden forgave humanity. She would correct this. "Forgiveness implies I decided you deserved it," she would say, with the almost smile that had stopped being almost anything. "What I decided was that the living things were worth more than the argument. There's a difference." Aaron would agree. He usually did, when she was right. Which was most of the time.